Picture this. The year is 1347. You're standing inside one of humanity's most formidable fortresses, walls so thick they could stop entire armies. You should feel invincible here, protected by 12 feet of solid stone. But something is terribly wrong. You're freezing. Your breath crystallizes in the air, and as the winter night deepens, you realize these walls that promise protection might actually kill you tonight. Before we dive into this forgotten world, I want to connect with you for just a moment. If you're here settling in for sleep, studying, or seeking an escape, would you help me with something small? Hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach others who might need it. And if this journey resonates with you, consider subscribing. But only if it feels right. I just cherish knowing you're here, sharing this moment across whatever distance separates us. Tell me in the comments, where are you right now? What does your clock say? Are you in Tokyo at 3 AM, London at midnight, New York winding down your evening? Drop your location and time below. I read every comment, and there's something magical about realizing we're all scattered across this planet, separated by oceans and time zones, yet connected here by curiosity and the search for story. Alright then, dim your lights, get comfortable, pull those blankets close. Tonight we're travelling back 7 centuries to uncover something extraordinary. The people who lived in medieval castles, those knights and nobles we imagine in glory, faced a nightly battle that nearly broke them. And their solutions? Some were brilliant innovations that influenced architecture for centuries. Some were so bizarre you'll question whether they worked, and some will make you profoundly grateful for your modern heated bedroom. Listen, can you hear it? The wind screams across the battlements, howling through every gap. You can hear it even through 12-foot thick walls. Your breath hangs in the air like smoke. The stone floor is so cold it burns through your boots until your toes go numb. Welcome to a medieval castle at night. Welcome to the fight for survival that played out every evening for hundreds of years. Here's the truth period dramas forget. Castles weren't built as homes. They were designed as weapons. Every feature, every architectural choice existed for one purpose: keeping enemies out. Those thick walls, perfect for stopping arrows and battering rams. Those narrow windows, ideal for archers. But here's the cruel irony. Everything that makes a castle impossible to conquer also makes it impossible to heat. You've built a massive stone refrigerator, and now you're trying to live inside it. The walls that protect you also trap the cold. Once the sun sets, something terrible happens. The castle interior becomes colder than outside. Stone absorbs the cold and radiates it inward all night. You could have 10 fireplaces blazing, consuming entire trees, and you'd still see your breath fog before your face. Let me paint the real picture. January 1347. You're a noble in a French castle. Your chamber is 30 feet wide with 20-foot ceilings. There's a magnificent fireplace roaring with flames so intense your face burns if you stand close. But 10 feet away, the air temperature is barely above freezing. Frost forms on the inside walls, those expensive tapestries hanging there, they're damp, nearly frozen, ice crystals forming in their fibres. The question every night isn't whether you'll be cold. That's guaranteed. The real question is whether you'll survive it. Whether you know the tricks, the rituals passed down through generations, the strategies that separate life from death. And that's what we're exploring tonight. How did they do it? How did anyone survive? Chapter 1. The Eternal Winter Night. Let's start with the most basic truth. Medieval people lived in a completely different relationship with darkness and cold than we do. When the sun set, the world transformed. Not just visually, but physically, temperatures that might have been tolerable during the day plummeted, and in a castle, with its vast empty spaces and stone construction, the cold became an entity, a living presence that stalked you through the corridors. Picture yourself trudging toward your bedchamber after a feast in the Great Hall. For the past few hours you've been somewhat warm, huddled near the central fire with dozens of other people. The hall was loud, smoky, crowded, but at least your hands stopped aching. You could feel your toes again. But now the feast is over. The servants are banking the fire, and you have to make the journey to your sleeping quarters. The moment you step away from the Great Hall, everything changes. The corridor is dark except for a single torch every 20 feet. Your breath immediately starts fogging. The temperature drop is shocking, like stepping from a warm room into winter night, because essentially, that's exactly what you're doing. The Great Hall was the only truly heated space in the entire castle. Everything beyond it might as well be outdoors. Your boots echo on the stone steps as you climb the spiral staircase. Each step takes you higher into the tower, further from any source of warmth. The walls here are slick with condensation. In the torchlight, you can see moisture running down the stone in little rivulets. By morning, this will be ice. Here's something that's going to surprise you. Sometimes peasants in their small cottages were warmer than nobles in their castles. I know that sounds backward. We imagine the poor freezing while the rich luxuriated in comfort. But the reality was often the opposite. A peasant's cottage might be one room with a central hearth. That single fire could warm the entire space. The family slept together, possibly with animals in the same room. It was cramped, it smelled, but it was warm. Meanwhile, the noble in his castle chamber had a room so large that even 3 fireplaces couldn't heat it effectively. He had magnificent furnishings, sure, beautiful tapestries, carved furniture, expensive blankets. But he also had vaulted ceilings that trapped all the heat up where it did no good, and walls so thick they acted like ice blocks. This is the great paradox of medieval sleep. Wealth brought you grander surroundings, but not necessarily comfort. Status meant larger chambers, but also colder nights. The very things that demonstrated your power, the soaring ceilings, the expansive rooms, the imposing stone architecture, were exactly what made survival harder. Now you might be thinking, surely they had solutions. They must have figured something out, and you're right, they did. Over centuries, medieval people developed an arsenal of tactics for surviving the night. Some were practical, some were ingenious, and some were so strange they'll make you laugh. But every single one was born from desperate necessity. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been so cold you couldn't sleep? Where no matter how you positioned yourself, some part of you was freezing. Your feet like ice, your nose burning, your shoulders aching. That was every winter night for medieval castle dwellers, and out of that discomfort came innovation. But here's what's fascinating. They didn't just solve the problem with physical means. They created rituals, beliefs, even superstitions around staying warm. The line between practical survival technique and magical thinking blurred. Because when you're fighting for your life every night, you'll try anything that might work. So as we move through this story together, you're going to discover layer after layer of how these people survived. Each chapter reveals another piece of the puzzle, another trick they used, another compromise they made, and I promise you, by the end, you'll never look at your own bed the same way again. If you're enjoying this so far, do me a favor and tap that like button. It really does help. And stick around, because what's coming next is where things get really interesting. We're about to step inside the bed itself, to understand the fortress within the fortress that medieval sleepers built every single night. Chapter 2: Stone Giants and Their Icy Hearts. Castles weren't just buildings, they were statements. When a lord constructed his fortress, he was declaring his power to everyone who saw it. The higher the walls, the more imposing the towers, the thicker the stone, the more respect he commanded. But there's an equation nobody talks about. The more impressive the castle, the more unbearable it was to actually live in. Let me tell you about a castle that still stands today in northern France, Château de Pierrefonds. When it was occupied in the 14th century, it had walls 15 feet thick in some places. 15 feet of solid stone. Imagine that. You could drive a car through the width of those walls. They were designed to laugh at siege weapons, to absorb the impact of battering rams and catapults without even cracking. But here's what those 15-foot walls also did. They turned every interior chamber into a tomb. The stone mass was so enormous that it absorbed cold like a sponge absorbs water. Once winter arrived and the temperature dropped, those walls became frozen blocks that radiated cold inward for months. No amount of fire could penetrate that thermal mass. There's a letter that survived from 1356, written by a visiting nobleman to his brother back home. He's describing his stay at English Castle, and he writes this: "The walls weep with cold. I placed my hand upon the stone and it burned me with frost. My beard grew ice in the night, and I thought surely I had died and gone to purgatory, for even hell, I am told, has fires." That's not poetic exaggeration. That's his actual experience. Walls so cold they felt like they burned, condensation so severe it ran down the stones in streams, and this wasn't some decrepit ruin. This was an actively maintained, wealthy household. The architecture of castles created what we'd now call thermal bridges. Every window, even when shuttered, was a weak point where cold poured in. Every door, no matter how thick, had gaps around its frame. The arrow slits, those narrow windows designed for defense, were like refrigerator vents pumping icy air directly into the living spaces. And here's something that makes it worse. Castles were often built on hilltops for strategic advantage. You could see enemies approaching from miles away. Excellent for defense, terrible for warmth. Those hilltops were exposed to constant wind. There was no natural shelter, no trees or slopes to block the gusts. Wind scoured every surface of the castle, forcing its way through every crack, every gap, every imperfection in the stonework. I want you to imagine waking up in such a place. You've survived the night somehow. Dawn is breaking. Grey light filters through the shutters, but instead of relief, you feel dread. Because now you have to leave the bed. You have to put your feet on that stone floor. You have to walk across the chamber to where your day clothes hang, each step an agony of cold. Your servants, if you have them, are already up. They've been up for an hour actually, trying to coax the fire back to life, trying to warm water for you to wash with. But the fire is reluctant. The wood is damp from the moisture in the air. The smoke chokes the room before the flames catch properly. And the water, even when heated, it loses warmth so fast you have to wash quickly before it becomes painful to touch. This was normal. This was daily life for the wealthiest, most powerful people in medieval society. And if they struggled, imagine what everyone else endured. But here's where human ingenuity comes in. Because medieval people weren't passive. They observed, they experimented, they shared knowledge. Over time, they discovered that certain architectural features helped. Not much, but every little bit mattered. Some castles built smaller chambers within larger ones, essentially rooms within rooms. The outer chamber acted as a buffer zone against the cold. Others positioned sleeping quarters above kitchens or bakehouses, where rising heat from below provided some relief. A few innovative builders even created crude chimney systems that channeled smoke from multiple fires through the walls, warming the stone slightly as it passed. Were these solutions effective? Marginally. The cold still dominated, but they show you something important. Medieval people weren't simply enduring, they were problem-solving. Every generation learned from the previous one and passed on new tactics. There's actually an ongoing debate among historians about this. Some argue that later medieval castles became significantly more comfortable as architectural knowledge improved. Others insist the improvements were minor, that even the best designed castle in 1450 was still brutally cold compared to what we'd consider livable. Who's right? Probably both. Comfort improved slowly over centuries, but the fundamental problem, stone mass and cold climate, never went away. You could mitigate, you couldn't solve. So as you lie there in your modern bed tonight, climate controlled and comfortable, I want you to appreciate something. Every single night's sleep you've ever had has been warmer and easier than the best sleep a medieval king ever experienced. Your worst night in a broken heater scenario is still better than their best night with every advantage. And we're just getting started. Because the stone walls were only the first challenge. Next, we need to talk about what medieval people put between themselves and that cold. The layers upon layers of fabric that became their primary defense. Stay with me, because this is where it gets really interesting. And if you're finding this fascinating, show some love with a like. It tells me you want more content like this. Chapter 3: The Science of Medieval Survival. Let's talk about what medieval people understood about staying warm and what they got wrong. Because the fascinating thing is, they had figured out some remarkably accurate principles, even though their scientific explanations were completely off base. Medieval medicine was built on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed that health meant keeping these fluids in perfect balance, and that temperature played a crucial role. Too much cold, they thought, would cause your humours to become sluggish and congeal, like honey in winter. This would lead to illness, depression, and eventually death. Now, from our modern perspective, that sounds ridiculous. We know there aren't four humours governing health. But here's what's interesting. The practical advice that came from this theory was often surprisingly good. Medieval physicians told people to keep their heads covered at night because heat escaped through the skull. That's actually true. We lose significant body heat through our heads. They recommended warm drinks before bed to heat the body from within. Also smart. They advised rubbing warm oil on feet and hands to improve circulation. Again, not a bad idea. They were getting the right answers from the wrong equations. Their theory was nonsense, but their observations were sharp. There's a medical text from the 13th century that I find absolutely fascinating. It's written by a physician advising a noble family on winter health. He writes, "The cold is an invader that seeks the warmth of the body as an army seeks a fortress. You must defend against it with layers, with fire, with warmed food and drink, with companionship, for bodies together are stronger than bodies alone." That's actually a pretty good summary of medieval survival strategy. And notice that last part. Bodies together are stronger than bodies alone. This wasn't just about sharing warmth, though that was important. It was about the psychological comfort of not facing the long night isolated and afraid. Medieval people understood something we've partially forgotten. Cold isn't just a physical challenge, it's a mental one. When you're freezing, when you can't get comfortable, when you're worried about whether you'll wake up in the morning, your mental state deteriorates. Fear makes cold feel worse. Anxiety prevents sleep. So medieval households created rituals around bedtime that addressed both physical and psychological needs. These weren't just practical preparations. They were ceremonies that transformed the terrifying prospect of night into something manageable. Let me walk you through a typical bedtime preparation for a wealthy household in winter. First, several hours before sleep, the warming pan was brought out. This was a long-handled metal pan, usually brass or copper, with a perforated lid. Hot coals from the hearth were scooped into it, and a servant would slide it back and forth between the bed sheets, warming them. The goal was to drive out the damp and raise the temperature of the fabric just enough that climbing into bed wouldn't be a shock. While this was happening, others prepared hot drinks. Mulled wine was popular, heated with spices like cinnamon, cloves, and ginger. The spices weren't just for flavour. They were believed to have warming properties, to heat the blood itself. A cup of this before bed would make your chest feel warm, your limbs heavy, your mind drowsy. Some households prepared hot water bottles, though not the rubber ones we know. They used leather pouches or ceramic vessels filled with boiling water, then wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed. These could stay warm for hours, keeping toes from going numb. Meanwhile, layers of clothing were laid out. You didn't strip down to sleep. You dressed up. A long linen nightshirt went on first, then possibly a wool tunic over that. A cap or coif was essential, tied under the chin to keep your head covered. Some people even wrapped their feet in strips of cloth, like primitive socks, adding extra insulation. Dogs were called to the bedside. This wasn't just affection, it was strategy. A large dog generates significant heat. 2 or 3 dogs in your bed could raise the temperature noticeably. They were living, breathing heaters. Bed curtains were drawn tight, creating a smaller space within the chamber. This mini environment could be warmed by body heat much more effectively than the vast room around it. Think of it like a tent inside your bedroom. Prayers were said. This wasn't optional or casual, it was essential. You were asking for protection through the night, not just from spiritual dangers, but from the very real threat of cold. Some prayers specifically mentioned frost, asking saints to keep it at bay. Finally, you climbed into bed, and this was its own skill. You had to move quickly once you were ready, sliding under the covers before the warmth you'd built up dissipated. You arranged yourself carefully, because every adjustment would let cold air in. Once settled, you stayed still. Now here's what modern people don't understand. This entire process took an hour or more. Preparing for sleep in a medieval castle wasn't quick. It was an involved, multi-step procedure that required help from others and careful execution. Sleep wasn't something you just fell into. It was something you constructed piece by piece, layer by layer. And even after all that work, success wasn't guaranteed. Some nights were just too cold, some winters too brutal, the wind too fierce. All your preparations would barely be enough to survive, let alone sleep comfortably. But the attempt mattered. The ritual itself provided comfort. Going through these familiar steps, involving family and servants, creating this protective cocoon, it made the night feel less threatening. You were doing something. You were fighting back. If you're lying in bed right now, think about your own routine. Maybe you brush your teeth, put on pajamas, check your phone, set an alarm. 5-10 minutes. For medieval people, bedtime preparations were a major event requiring coordination and effort. And you know what? I think that's something we've lost. We've gained convenience, absolutely, but we've lost the intentionality. Medieval people treated sleep as precious because it was hard won. Every comfortable night was a victory. Stay with me here, because we're about to dive into the specific materials and objects they used. The tapestries, the furs, the ingenious little tools that made all the difference. And if this is resonating with you, hit that like button. Let me know you're here with me on this journey. Chapter 4. Layers upon Layers, the Textile Fortress. If stone was the first line of defense against enemies, fabric was the first line of defense against cold, and medieval people took this seriously. The amount of textile in a wealthy household's bedchamber would shock you. We're not talking about a comforter and a couple of pillows. We're talking about literally hundreds of pounds of wool, linen, and fur. Let me describe a bed that actually existed. It's documented in a 1372 inventory from a French duke's household. The bed frame itself was oak, carved and imposing, standing about 6 feet high. The mattress, and I'm not kidding about this, was stuffed with 40 pounds of goose feathers. On top of that was a second mattress, this one filled with wool. Then came the sheets, multiple layers of linen, then blankets, 5 of them, each wool and heavy enough that one person struggled to lift it. On top of those, a coverlet made of marten fur, then another of fox fur, and finally, draped over the whole construction, a quilted covering made of silk backed with wool. That's not even counting the curtains. The bed had full hangings on all 4 sides, made of wool tapestry, lined with linen, and heavy enough that they didn't blow in drafts. These curtains weren't decoration. They were walls, creating a room within the room. The total weight of all this fabric? Over 200 pounds. Sleeping under this much material meant you could barely move. But that was the point. You were pinned down, locked in place, trapped inside a textile cocoon that held every bit of body heat you generated. Here's something that's both amusing and telling. There are several records of elderly nobles who literally couldn't get out of bed alone. Not because they were infirm, but because they were so buried under blankets that they needed servants to lift the layers off. One account describes a visiting nobleman who, trying to rise in the night to use the chamber pot, got tangled in his blankets and fell, taking half the bedding with him to the floor. But for every story like that, there are 10 more of people who swore by this method, because it worked. Once you were sealed inside this fabric fortress, with curtains closed and dogs piled on top, your body heat had nowhere to go. The temperature inside your bed cocoon could be 20 or 30 degrees warmer than the chamber around it. Now let's talk about what those fabrics actually were, because there's fascinating variety here. Linen was the foundation. It touched your skin, formed the base layer. Medieval people believed linen was healthy, that it let the skin breathe while also providing smoothness. They were partially right. Linen does wick moisture better than wool, which matters when you're sleeping under pounds of heavy material. Wool was the workhorse. Sheep were everywhere in medieval Europe, so wool was relatively abundant. It came in different qualities, from coarse peasant wool that was scratchy and rough, to fine wool from specialized breeds that was almost soft. But all wool shared one crucial property. It insulated even when damp, and in a stone castle where everything was slightly moist from condensation, that mattered enormously. Fur was the luxury layer, but it was also the most effective insulator. Bear fur, wolf fur, fox, marten, ermine, each had different properties. Bear fur was incredibly warm but heavy and expensive. Fox fur was lighter but still effective. Ermine was mostly for show, thin and decorative rather than practical. There's actually a whole medieval treatise on the properties of different furs for bedding. I'm not making this up. A 14th century German text ranks animals by how warm their pelts keep you. The author did experiments, timing how long different furs kept a heated stone warm. His conclusion: bear was best, followed by wolf, then beaver, then various smaller animals. Medieval people were scientific about this stuff. They didn't have thermometers or precise measurements, but they observed carefully and shared knowledge. Over generations, they built up a body of practical expertise about textiles and warmth. But here's the catch. All this fabric wealth was reserved for the elite. A peasant family might have one wool blanket, maybe two, passed down through generations and patched repeatedly. They'd sleep together for warmth, often on a simple straw mattress with one covering shared among several people. Yet even peasants understood the principle. Layer everything you have. Use every scrap of fabric. Position your bed as close to the fire as you dare. Sleep together to share heat. The execution was different, but the strategy was the same. One detail I love is that there was actually a used fabric market in medieval cities. Old blankets, worn-out tapestries, even nobles' discarded bed curtains would eventually filter down to lower classes. A merchant might buy a moth-eaten tapestry that was no longer presentable in a castle, patch it up, and use it as a blanket. The fabric had value even in degraded form because it still held warmth. This is so different from our modern relationship with bedding. We think about thread count and softness. They thought about survival. A blanket wasn't a comfort item. It was a tool, as essential as any weapon or cooking pot. And you know what's remarkable? Some of these medieval textiles still exist. Museums have fragments of bedding from noble households. When you see them in person, what strikes you is how heavy they are. Pick up a medieval wool blanket and you understand immediately why people couldn't move under them. These aren't like our fluffy comforters. They're dense, compressed, seriously heavy. Imagine sleeping under that weight every night. Imagine the smell of wool and fur, the scratch of coarse fabric, the suffocating enclosure of drawn curtains. It wasn't comfortable by our standards, but it kept people alive. And that's the theme that keeps coming back. Medieval sleep wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. Every textile, every layer, every carefully positioned curtain was part of a system designed to keep your body temperature above the point of no return. We're going to take a brief pause here, but don't go anywhere. What's coming up next is one of the strangest and most ingenious devices medieval people invented. Something you've probably never heard of, but which made an enormous difference on the coldest nights. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into medieval life, let your friends know. Share this video with someone who loves history, or someone who complains about being cold in their modern heated house. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more content like this. Chapter 5: The Warming Pan Mystery. Alright, let's talk about one of the most underrated pieces of medieval technology, the warming pan. This thing doesn't look like much, just a metal pan with a long handle and a perforated lid, but in the winter months, it was absolutely essential. And there's actually a fascinating mystery surrounding how and when it was invented. The basic concept is simple. You fill the pan with hot coals from the hearth, close the lid, and slide it between your bed sheets for several minutes before you climb in. The metal heats the fabric, driving out dampness and raising the temperature just enough to make that first contact with the bed bearable instead of shocking. But here's where it gets interesting. We don't actually know exactly when warming pans were invented. They start showing up in household inventories in the 14th century, but there are references to similar devices much earlier. Some historians think the Romans had something comparable. Others argue it's a medieval innovation that spread quickly once someone figured it out. What we do know is that by the 15th century they were everywhere. Rich households had multiple warming pans, different sizes for different beds. Some were purely functional, plain brass or iron. Others were elaborate, decorated with engravings, the handles carved with family crests. Because, of course, even a utilitarian object became a status symbol. There's a household manual from 1486 that gives detailed instructions for using a warming pan correctly, and I'm fascinated by how specific it is. This servant is told to use old coals, well burned, not fresh from the fire, lest they smoke and foul the linens. The pan should be moved in circles and spirals, never left in one place, lest it scorch the fabric. The process should take long enough to say 3 paternosters, which is probably about 5 minutes. This level of detail tells you something. Using a warming pan was a skill. Do it wrong and you'd burn holes in expensive sheets, fill the room with smoke, or fail to warm the bed effectively. Do it right, and you created a pocket of warmth that made sleep possible. But warming pans were also dangerous. Really dangerous. There are numerous records of fires started by warming pans. A servant leaves it in the bed too long, or doesn't notice a coal has fallen out, and suddenly the straw mattress is smouldering. In a castle full of flammable material, tapestries, wooden furniture, thatched roofs in some sections, a fire could be catastrophic. One tragic account from 1392 describes a fire in an English castle that killed 3 people, started when a warming pan was left unattended in a bedchamber. The investigation noted that the servant responsible had fallen asleep while waiting for the coals to cool enough to remove. By the time anyone noticed smoke, the fire had spread through multiple rooms. This created a constant tension. You desperately needed the warming pan to make your bed habitable, but using it meant risk. So households developed strict protocols. Servants were trained carefully. The pan was never left alone. Someone always watched until it was safely removed and the coals disposed of properly. Wealthier households had a designated fire watch servant whose job was partly to make sure warming pans didn't cause disasters. This person would patrol at night, checking chambers, making sure all coals were properly extinguished. It was tedious work, but essential. Now here's a question that historians debate. Did warming pans actually make a significant difference, or was the effect mostly psychological? Some argue that the warmth from a warming pan dissipated within minutes, that you were basically climbing into a bed that felt warm but wouldn't stay that way. Others insist that even a brief period of warmth was enough to relax the body and make sleep onset easier. I think both are true. The physical warmth faded quickly, but the psychological impact was real. Knowing your bed had been prepared, that someone had gone to the trouble of warming it, that you weren't just throwing yourself into freezing sheets, all of that made the night less daunting. There's also evidence that some people used warming pans more creatively. Instead of just running them over sheets, they'd heat the bed curtains, warm the pillows, even heat the clothing they'd wear to bed. One account describes a noble woman who had her nightcap warmed with a small pan before putting it on. These weren't standard practices, but they show how people experimented. Peasants, of course, didn't have brass warming pans, but they improvised. A common tactic was to heat stones in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and place them at the foot of the bed. Same principle, cruder execution. These heated stones could stay warm for hours, much longer than coals in a pan. The trade-off was they didn't heat the whole bed, just provided a warm spot for feet. Some families even had special stones designated for this purpose, smooth river stones that held heat well and didn't crack when heated repeatedly. These stones would be passed down through generations, valued possessions despite being, literally, just rocks. I find this incredibly moving. The fact that a family would treasure a particular stone because it kept their feet warm at night. It shows you how valuable warmth was, how every small advantage mattered. There's a folk belief that shows up in several regions. Certain stones were thought to hold warmth better because they were blessed, or because they came from a holy site, or because they'd been heated by particular types of wood. Obviously nonsense from a scientific standpoint. But it reveals how much people wanted to believe they could control this one aspect of their lives. The warming pan, whether metal or stone, whether expensive or improvised, represents something important. It's evidence that medieval people didn't just passively suffer through cold nights. They invented tools, they developed techniques, they passed on knowledge. Every generation refined the process of making night survivable. And you know what's wild? Warming pans continued to be used well into the 20th century in some places. Even with better heating, people valued that ritual of prepared warmth. My own grandmother, in rural Ireland in the 1940s, used a warming pan. The practice had been continuous for at least 500 years. Think about that. Half a millennium of humans doing basically the same thing, generation after generation, because it worked. That's the kind of knowledge that gets embedded in culture, passed from parent to child as essential wisdom. So tonight, when you slip into your bed without a second thought, maybe spare a moment of appreciation for the fact that you don't need a servant with a pan of hot coals to make it bearable. Comfort has been democratized. What was once a luxury for the wealthy warm sheets is now something we take completely for granted. But we're not done exploring medieval solutions. Next, we need to talk about something that might surprise you: the role of animals in medieval sleep. Because it wasn't just dogs, though they were important. The relationship between humans and animals at night was complex, intimate, and absolutely essential for survival. Stay with me, and if you're finding value in this, show some love with a like and a comment. Tell me what surprised you most so far. Chapter 6. Creatures of Comfort. Here's something that will probably seem strange to modern sensibilities. In medieval times, bringing animals into your bed wasn't just acceptable, it was smart. Dogs, cats, even larger animals played a crucial role in surviving cold nights. And the relationship between humans and these creatures reveals something beautiful about medieval life. Let's start with dogs, because they were the most common bed companions. Medieval dogs weren't like modern pets. They had jobs: hunting dogs, guard dogs, herding dogs, each with specific roles. But when night came, many of these working animals became something else: heaters. A large dog generates significant body heat. Their normal body temperature is about 101 to 102 degrees Fahrenheit, a few degrees warmer than humans. Lying against a dog, or better yet, having dogs on multiple sides, could raise your body temperature noticeably. This wasn't a luxury, it was practical survival strategy. There are beautiful illuminated manuscripts that show this. In the margins of religious texts, you'll find tiny paintings of people in bed with dogs curled at their feet or nestled against their backs. These weren't just decorative choices by the artists, they were depicting normal life. One of my favourite historical documents is a will from 1378. An English noblewoman is leaving instructions for after her death, and she specifically bequeaths her favourite dog to her niece. Noting that the hound has lain beside me these 12 winters and knows well the art of sharing warmth. The art of sharing warmth. That phrase is so telling. It wasn't automatic. Dogs had to learn to stay still through the night, to not fidget or wander off. A good bed dog was genuinely valuable. There's also evidence that certain breeds were preferred for this purpose. Larger dogs with thick coats were ideal, Mastiffs, wolfhounds, the ancestors of modern Great Pyrenees. These dogs could weigh 100 pounds or more, and their bulk was as important as their fur. They acted like living, breathing hot water bottles. But here's what's really interesting. The warmth exchange went both ways. Dogs benefited from sleeping with humans too. A castle was cold for everyone, including animals. By sleeping together, humans and dogs created a shared warm zone that helped both species survive. It was genuinely symbiotic. Cats were less common in beds, mostly because medieval cats were semi-wild mousers, not the domesticated lap cats we know today. But in some households, particularly those of women, cats did share sleeping spaces. They were smaller and less warm than dogs, but their purring seems to have had psychological value. Multiple medieval texts mention cats as comfortable companions, suggesting their presence was soothing even beyond the physical warmth. Now, here's where it gets really strange. In peasant households, larger animals sometimes shared living spaces at night. Cows, goats, even pigs in some cases. This wasn't about companionship, it was pure survival. A cow generates tremendous heat. Their metabolism is high, they're large, and they're covered in dense hide. Peasant cottages were often divided into two sections, one for humans, one for animals, with only a partial wall, or even just a different floor level separating them. At night, the heat from those animals would rise and spread, warming the human living space. Some travellers' accounts describe this with horror. Visiting nobles would write home about having to sleep in cottages where the stench of beasts filled every breath, and the lowing of cattle disturbed all rest. But they'd also note grudgingly that these cottages were warmer than castle chambers. There's a practical calculation happening here. Peasants were choosing warmth over cleanliness, survival over dignity, and honestly, it was probably the right choice. Better to smell like a cow barn than freeze to death in a clean space. In some extreme northern regions, there are accounts of people sleeping directly in barns, among the animals during the worst cold snaps. This wasn't normal, but in a particularly brutal winter, when your cottage couldn't be kept warm no matter what you did, moving into the animal space became a last resort option. Medieval people even had a proverb about this. I've found it in several different languages with slight variations, but it basically translates to better a warm barn than a cold palace. The meaning is obvious, but it's interesting that they felt the need to say it. It suggests there was some shame or social stigma around sleeping with animals, but practical necessity overrode that. Birds were another animal that occasionally played a role. Chickens and other fowl were sometimes brought indoors at night, both to protect them from predators and to use their body heat. A coop of chickens in the corner of a one-room cottage added warmth, and also meant eggs were within reach in the morning. There's a strange account from Scotland about geese being used as bed warmers. The claim is that geese were allowed to nest in straw near the bed, and their body heat warmed the straw, which in turn warmed the sleepers. I'm skeptical about how practical this really was, given that geese are aggressive and noisy. But the fact that someone wrote it down suggests the idea at least existed. What all of this reveals is a relationship between humans and animals that we've mostly lost. For medieval people, animals weren't pets in our modern sense. They were partners in survival. The warmth exchange at night was one of many ways that humans and animals depended on each other. And I think there's something profound in that. Medieval people understood viscerally that they weren't separate from nature. They were part of it, dependent on other species for their continued existence. Every night reminded them of that connection. Compare that to modern life, where we climate control our environments to the point that we barely think about temperature. We don't need dogs to stay warm. We don't share our homes with cattle. We've created artificial separation between ourselves and other animals. Gained independence, sure, but also lost something. I'm not romanticizing medieval life. I wouldn't want to live that way. But I do think we can appreciate what they understood. That life is interdependent. That warmth, comfort, survival are often collective achievements, not individual ones. If you have pets, maybe tonight you'll appreciate them a little differently. That cat purring on your lap, that dog curled against your legs, they're echoing a partnership that goes back centuries. They're doing what their ancestors did, sharing warmth, providing comfort, making the night less lonely. And speaking of collective survival, we need to talk about something that might surprise you. The great paradox of medieval sleep. The question of who actually slept better, nobles in their castles or peasants in their cottages. The answer isn't what you'd expect. Stick around, because this is where class and comfort collide in fascinating ways. And if this is the kind of content you love, subscribe. There's so much more to explore. Chapter 7. The Great Class Paradox. So let's address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the elephant in the castle. We've been talking about medieval sleep as if it was uniformly difficult, but the reality is more complicated. There was a strange paradox where wealth and status didn't necessarily translate to better sleep. In fact, in many ways, nobles had it worse. I want to start with a specific example. There's a court record from 1403 describing a dispute between a lord and his steward. The steward had built himself a small chamber attached to the kitchen, and the lord was angry, accusing him of overstepping his position. But here's what's fascinating. When questioned, the steward defended himself by saying his chamber, though small, was warmer than the lord's, and as he was elderly, he needed warmth more than space. The lord couldn't really argue with this. His own vast chamber, for all its tapestries and fine furnishings, was notoriously cold. The steward's modest room, heated by proximity to the kitchen, was genuinely more comfortable. The case was eventually dismissed because even the other nobles understood the steward had a point. This wasn't an isolated example. Size was the enemy of warmth. The larger your living space, the harder it was to heat. And nobles, by necessity of their social position, had large chambers. These rooms were designed to make statements, to host small gatherings, to display wealth through sheer volume. A noble's bedchamber might be 30 by 40 feet with a 20-foot ceiling. That's 24,000 cubic feet of air to heat. Even with a massive fireplace blazing, most of that space stayed cold. Heat rises, so the ceiling would be tolerably warm while the floor remained icy. Meanwhile, a peasant's cottage might be one room, 15 by 15 feet with an 8-foot ceiling. That's less than 2,000 cubic feet. A single hearth could warm that space effectively. The whole family slept in the same room, often in the same bed, generating collective body heat. Animals were nearby, adding their warmth. The space was cramped and privacy was non-existent, but it was warm. There are multiple accounts of nobles visiting peasant cottages and being surprised by how warm they were. One French chronicle from the 1380s describes a lord taking shelter from a storm in a villager's home and being shocked that he could remove his cloak indoors. In his own castle, he wore his cloak all day. So here's the paradox. Nobles had more resources. They could afford more blankets, better furs, warming pans, servants to prepare their beds. But they were fighting against impossible architectural odds. The very castles that demonstrated their power and wealth were thermal disasters. Peasants had almost no resources. 1 or 2 blankets, simple straw mattresses, basic hearths, but their living spaces worked with them, not against them. Small, tight, well suited to the heating technology available. Does this mean peasants were actually more comfortable? Not exactly. Because peasants faced other hardships, they had fewer defences against genuine disasters. If their one blanket got wet or their hearth went out, they had no backup. Nobles had redundancy, multiple fireplaces, extra blankets, servants to fix problems. But on an average winter night for basic sleeping comfort, a peasant in a cottage might genuinely sleep better than a lord in a castle. That's a remarkable reversal of how we usually think about medieval life. There's also the question of expectations. Nobles were raised with certain standards. They expected space, privacy, refined surroundings. Being cold in a vast chamber was somehow more tolerable than being warm in a small one, because the small one felt beneath their dignity. Peasants had no such expectations. They'd never known anything but tight quarters and shared spaces. What a noble would view as intolerable crowding was normal and even comfortable to them. The psychological difference mattered. I've found several medieval texts that comment on this explicitly. One monk, writing about poverty and humility, notes that the poor sleep sounder than princes, for their small homes hold warmth and their cares are fewer. That's obviously idealized. Peasants had plenty of cares, but the observation about warmth is accurate. There's also evidence that some nobles understood this and tried to adapt. Smaller winter chambers became popular in later medieval periods. These were modest rooms, by noble standards, where families would retreat during the coldest months. They'd shut down the grand chambers and live in spaces that were easier to heat. But this created social complications. A noble who spent all his time in small practical rooms wasn't properly displaying his status. Visitors expected to be received in grand chambers. There was social pressure to live in uncomfortable spaces because those spaces demonstrated power. This is something we still see today, actually. People buying houses that are too large to comfortably heat or cool because size equals status. We've inherited this idea that bigger is automatically better, even when it's functionally worse. Medieval peasants, whatever their other hardships, at least didn't have that particular burden. Their homes were small because that's all they could afford, but that size ended up being an advantage for the one thing that mattered most every night. Warmth. There's a detail in multiple household accounts that I find telling. Nobles often slept with bed curtains drawn so tightly that their sleeping space was basically reduced to the volume of the bed itself. They were trying to create a small, warm space within their large, cold chamber. Essentially, they were trying to recreate the conditions of a peasant's cottage, but surrounded by grandeur they couldn't practically enjoy. Think about the psychology of that. You're lying in an enormously expensive bed, covered with the finest materials money can buy, in a chamber decorated with priceless tapestries, and you're cold. Meanwhile, you know that the people working in your kitchen, sleeping in their tiny rooms, are probably warmer than you. That must have been frustrating, maybe even a little humiliating. Your wealth could buy objects, but it couldn't buy comfort. Not the comfort that mattered most, not warmth. Of course, nobles had other advantages that outweighed this one disadvantage. Better food, medical care, safety, leisure. I'm not suggesting peasants had better lives overall, they emphatically didn't. But in this one specific area, survival of cold nights, the advantage sometimes went to those with less. It's a reminder that technology and wealth don't solve every problem. Sometimes physical constraints matter more than resources. A small fire in a small room beats a large fire in a large room. Simple physics, but it had profound implications for medieval sleep. So as you think about your own life, maybe there's a lesson here. Bigger isn't always better, more isn't always more comfortable. Sometimes the right size, the right scale matters more than sheer abundance. And speaking of abundance, or the lack of it, we need to talk about the actual mechanics of medieval heating. The fires, the smoke, the constant trade-offs between warmth and breathability. Because keeping warm meant accepting conditions that would be intolerable to us today. Let's dive into that next. And if you're enjoying this exploration of medieval life, let me know in the comments what aspect has surprised you most. Chapter 8: Fires, Smoke, and the Price of Heat. Let's talk about something medieval people dealt with every single night but rarely complained about in writing, probably because it was so normal they didn't think to mention it. Smoke. If you wanted warmth in a medieval building, you accepted smoke. There was no way around it, and the health consequences were severe, though they didn't fully understand that at the time. Medieval fireplaces and hearths were crude by our standards. Yes, they evolved over time. Early medieval halls had central hearths with no chimneys at all, just smoke rising to the rafters and eventually escaping through gaps in the roof. Later, wall fireplaces with chimneys became common. But even the best medieval chimney was inefficient. Why? Several reasons. First, the draft was inconsistent. Chimneys were large, often built into thick walls with rough stone interiors. The smoke path wasn't smooth. It would eddy, swirl, and frequently blow back into the room, especially when wind hit the castle in certain ways. Second, the wood itself was often green or damp. Dry seasoned firewood burns cleaner, but that required storage space and planning. Often, wood was brought in from the forest and burned within days or weeks. Damp wood produces enormous amounts of smoke as it releases moisture. Third, they didn't have good control over airflow. Modern fireplaces have dampers, adjustable vents, ways to regulate how much air feeds the fire. Medieval hearths were basically wide open. You built a fire and hoped for the best. The result was that medieval chambers, especially in winter when fires burned constantly, were chronically smoky. Not always thick, choking smoke, but a perpetual haze. Your eyes stung. Your throat was scratchy. Everything smelled of smoke. Your clothes, your hair, your bedding, your skin. There's archaeological evidence for this. When researchers examine medieval buildings, they find soot deposits everywhere. Not just on the hearth and chimney, but on walls, ceilings, even in cracks in the floor. The smoke permeated everything. Health-wise, this was devastating. Chronic exposure to wood smoke causes respiratory problems, coughing, bronchitis, reduced lung capacity, increased vulnerability to pneumonia. Medieval people suffered from these conditions at much higher rates than we do, and smoke exposure was a major cause. But here's the thing, they didn't really have a choice. You needed fire to survive the cold. The smoke was just the price you paid, so people adapted. They accepted coughing as normal. They developed folk remedies for sore throats. They positioned beds away from hearths when possible, trying to find spots where the air was slightly clearer. Some households tried to mitigate the problem. Burning certain types of wood, like apple or oak, produced less smoke than others, like pine. Wealthy families could be selective about fuel. They'd also maintain their chimneys, sending servants up to clear out soot buildup that worsened draft. There's a household manual from the 15th century that recommends burning dried herbs on the fire before bed to cleanse the air. Rosemary, sage, and lavender were favourites. The aromatic smoke was thought to be healthier than plain wood smoke, and it certainly smelled better. Whether it actually helped is debatable, but the attempt shows they recognize smoke as a problem. In peasant cottages without proper chimneys, the smoke situation was even worse. The fire was in the center of the room, and smoke filled the entire space before slowly escaping through the thatch. People lived in a constant fog. They got used to it, but visitors from towns with better hearths would find it almost unbearable. One traveller's account from the 14th century describes staying in a Scottish cottage and writing, "The air was so thick with smoke I could scarce see across the room, and the people seemed not to notice, so accustomed were they to this foulness." He spent the night coughing and left as soon as dawn broke. But those people probably slept just fine. When you live with smoke from childhood, your body adapts to some degree. Your cough reflex becomes less sensitive. You learn to breathe shallowly when smoke thickens. It's still damaging, but you function. There's also evidence that smoke had one unintended benefit. It kept insect populations down. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs don't thrive in smoky environments. So while the smoke was unhealthy for humans, it did reduce pest problems compared to what might have occurred otherwise. Medieval people even joked about this. There's a proverb that appears in several languages. A smoky house makes bright eyes, meaning it keeps you alert and drives away pests. Obviously trying to find a silver lining in an unavoidable problem, the trade-offs were brutal. To be warm, you had to accept smoke. To avoid smoke, you had to be cold. There was no third option, so people chose warmth and dealt with the consequences. I think about this when we complain about modern inconveniences. We get upset if our heating system is a little noisy, or if it makes the air slightly dry. Medieval people would laugh at those concerns. They'd trade our problems for their solutions in a heartbeat. But they didn't have that option, so they endured, coughing through smoky nights, waking with stinging eyes and soot-blackened skin, accepting this as the normal price of survival. It makes you wonder what aspects of our current lives we're accepting as normal that future generations will look back on with horror. What trade-offs are we making now that seem necessary, but will one day be viewed as barbaric? For medieval people, the smoke was just life. For us, it's almost unimaginable. That gap in experience is what makes history so fascinating and so humbling. Now, all this talk of fires and smoke brings up another interesting aspect of medieval sleep. The fact that people didn't sleep through the night in one continuous block. They practiced what historians call segmented sleep, and the fire was central to this pattern. Let's explore that next, because it completely changes how we think about normal sleep. And if you're still with me, thank you. Drop a like to let me know you're engaged with this journey. Chapter 9. The Night Watch. Segmented Sleep. Here's something that's going to surprise you about medieval sleep. They didn't do it the way we do. We assume that going to bed for 7-8 continuous hours is natural and universal. But for medieval people, that wasn't normal at all. Instead, they practiced what's called segmented sleep or biphasic sleep. And once you understand this pattern, a lot of medieval behavior makes more sense. The typical pattern went like this. People went to bed shortly after dark, which in winter might be as early as 5 or 6 p.m. They'd sleep for 3-4 hours. This was called first sleep. Then they'd wake up naturally around midnight or 1 a.m. They'd stay awake for 1-2 hours. This period had a special name in many languages. In English, it was called the watching or the watch. Then they'd go back to sleep for another 3-4 hours until dawn. This was second sleep. This isn't speculation. We have overwhelming evidence for this pattern. Court records, diaries, medical texts, literature, all of them casually mention first sleep and second sleep as normal concepts. People didn't think it was strange. It was just how sleep worked. But what did they do during the watch, that period of wakefulness in the middle of the night? Several things. First, and most practically, they tended fires. Remember, keeping embers alive through the night was crucial. The watch was the perfect time to add logs, stir the coals, and make sure the fire didn't die out. Second, they prayed. Medieval life was deeply religious, and there were specific prayers associated with nighttime waking. Some monastic orders had official midnight prayer services, but even lay people would say prayers during the watch. Third, they talked. If you were married or sharing a bed, the watch was a time for quiet conversation. There are references in medieval texts to pillow talk specifically during the nighttime waking period. Apparently, this was when couples discussed private matters, made plans, or simply enjoyed each other's company. Fourth, they sometimes ate light snacks. Not full meals, but bread, cheese, maybe a drink of ale or watered wine. There's even evidence of special night food being prepared in some households. And fifth, they engaged in, let's say, intimate activities. Medieval advice manuals for married couples actually recommend the watch as the best time for this, suggesting that bodies were rested from first sleep but not yet heavy with second sleep. The watch was also a time for creativity. Some of the most productive work happened during these midnight hours. Poets and scholars mention composing during the watch. The quiet, the lack of distractions made it ideal for focused thought. One of my favourite historical details is that burglars specifically planned around segmented sleep. They knew that during first sleep and second sleep people were deeply unconscious, but during the watch people were awake and alert. So thieves would wait until the watch period passed and second sleep began before attempting break-ins. Now, here's the fascinating question. Why did medieval people sleep this way, and why don't we? Some researchers believe it's related to natural light cycles. Before electric lighting, human circadian rhythms may have been different. The long darkness of night, 12-14 hours in winter, was too long for continuous sleep. Bodies naturally divided it into segments. Others think it's about temperature and comfort. Medieval sleep was uncomfortable. You'd wake up because you were cold, or because the fire had died down, or because your position had become painful under heavy blankets. So people incorporated these wakings into their expected routine rather than fighting them. But here's what really changed everything. Artificial lighting. As candles became cheaper, and then gas lamps and finally electric lights, people started staying up later. Bedtime shifted from shortly after dark to 9, 10, 11 p.m. or later. The night got shorter, and with less total darkness, the natural tendency towards segmented sleep disappeared. By the 19th century, doctors were describing segmented sleep as old-fashioned or even unhealthy, a relic of primitive times. The industrial age, with its factory shifts and standardized schedules, demanded continuous sleep. 8 hours straight, no interruptions. That became the new normal. But in medieval times, if you woke up at 1 a.m, you didn't think something was wrong. You thought it was time for the watch. You'd get up, tend the fire, say a prayer, maybe chat with your spouse, then go back to sleep without anxiety. Compare that to modern sleep problems. We wake up at 2 a.m. and immediately worry that something's wrong, that we have insomnia, that we need medication. We've pathologized what might actually be natural. Some sleep researchers now argue that segmented sleep might actually be healthier than our modern pattern. The wake period in the middle allows stress hormones to process, provides a natural meditation period, and might reduce the build-up of sleep pressure that causes problems. I'm not suggesting we should all go back to medieval sleep patterns. Modern life doesn't accommodate it. But it's fascinating to realise that our current way of sleeping, which seems so natural and obvious, is actually quite new. For most of human history, people slept differently, and for medieval people, the watch was crucial for survival. That's when fires were tended, when vigilance was maintained. Without that midnight waking, many more people would have frozen or died in fires. It also created a different relationship with night. We treat night as dead time, a void to pass through unconsciously. Medieval people experienced night as active time, a period of wakefulness and awareness, just quieter and slower than day. There's something beautiful about that, I think. The idea that night wasn't something to be defeated or eliminated, but rather engaged with on its own terms. Medieval people weren't fighting night. They were living with it, working within its rhythms. So tonight, if you wake up at 2 a.m, maybe don't immediately reach for your phone or worry about insomnia. Maybe just lie there for a moment and think about all the people throughout history who were doing the same thing. Tending fires, saying prayers, existing quietly in the dark. You're part of an ancient tradition, even if you don't realize it. And speaking of tradition, we need to talk about the spiritual dimension of medieval sleep. Because warmth wasn't just physical, it was also metaphysical. The rituals, charms, and prayers that surrounded sleep were as important as blankets and fires. That's next. And if this is opening your mind to new perspectives on history, share it with someone. Help this content reach people who appreciate deep dives into the past. Chapter 10. Rituals, Charms, and Medieval Magic. Let's talk about something that shows up everywhere in medieval sleep, but is often dismissed by historians. The spiritual and magical practices people used to protect themselves through the night. Because for medieval people, cold wasn't the only danger. The night was full of unseen threats, and they defended against those just as carefully as they defended against the physical cold. Start with the most basic practice. Prayers before sleep. This wasn't optional. Every single night people prayed. If you were Christian, which nearly everyone in medieval Europe was, you said your paternoster at minimum. Many people had longer, more elaborate nighttime prayer routines. But these weren't just expressions of piety, they were protective rituals. The prayers were believed to create a barrier against evil forces that were strongest at night. Demons, evil spirits, the devil himself, all were thought to prowl during darkness. Prayer sanctified your sleeping space. There's a beautiful night prayer from the 14th century that I want to share. It goes, "Lord, as I lay myself to sleep, guard my body from the cold that steals life, guard my soul from the dark that steals hope, and grant that I may wake to see thy sun once more." Notice how it addresses both physical and spiritual dangers. Cold and darkness are parallel threats. Beyond prayers, people used physical objects as protective charms. Crosses were the most common. Most people wore a small cross or crucifix at all times, but at night, additional crosses might be placed around the room, on the wall above the bed, on the door, sometimes even sewn into bedding or clothing. But crosses weren't the only protective symbols. There's fascinating evidence of pre-Christian practices persisting, blended with Christian ones. Certain herbs were believed to ward off evil. Rue, vervain, St. John's wort. These were hung in sleeping chambers or stuffed into pillows. They were blessed by priests, Christianizing what were essentially pagan folk practices. Iron objects were another common protection. An iron knife placed under the pillow, iron nails driven into the bed frame, horseshoes hung above the door. Iron was believed to repel fairies, demons, and witches. This belief is ancient, predating Christianity by thousands of years, but it continued throughout the medieval period. There's a household inventory from 1420 that lists, among the bedchamber contents, 6 iron nails blessed set in the bedposts. This was a wealthy, educated family. They weren't superstitious peasants, but they still took the precaution of iron protection. Salt was another protective substance. Circles of salt might be placed around a baby's cradle, or salt mixed with prayers and scattered in the corners of a room. Salt was considered pure, incorruptible, and therefore anathema to evil. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Some practices specifically addressed cold as a supernatural force. Cold wasn't just physics, it was a malevolent entity. Winter was thought to be when death had more power, when the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead thinned. There are folk prayers that personify cold and ask saints to restrain it. Saint Martin, bind the winter's hands, that it may not squeeze the life from us. St. Martin's Day, November 11th, was considered the official start of winter, and prayers to St. Martin for protection from cold were common. Certain saints became associated with warmth and winter survival. St. Agatha, St. Blaise, St. Sebastian, each had specialties, but all were called upon for winter protection. People would keep images or medallions of these saints in their bedchambers. There's also evidence of more explicitly magical practices, charms that were not quite Christian but were tolerated. For example, the custom of speaking to the fire itself, thanking it for warmth and asking it to burn through the night. This is arguably worshipping the fire as a spirit, but it was so common that church officials mostly looked the other way. In some regions, people left offerings for household spirits, entities believed to dwell in the hearth or walls, a bit of bread, a cup of milk, left out at night to keep these spirits friendly. In return, the spirits would supposedly help maintain the fire and keep the household safe. Medieval church officials had complicated attitudes about these practices. Officially, they were against anything that smacked of paganism or magic. But practically, they often incorporated folk beliefs, blessing herbs, sanctifying protective rituals, allowing people to keep their traditional practices as long as they were given a Christian framing. The result was a rich, complex spiritual landscape around sleep. People were hedging their bets using every protection available, both Christian prayers and older folk magic. And honestly, who can blame them? When you're facing a night that might kill you, when you're lying in the dark with wind howling and frost creeping up the walls, you want every possible defense. If prayer helps, you pray. If iron helps, you use iron. If asking the fire to keep burning makes you feel better, you ask. This is where the psychological and the practical merge completely. Did these rituals actually keep people warmer? No, not physically. But did they help people sleep despite fear and discomfort? Absolutely. Modern sleep science recognizes this. Bedtime rituals are important. They signal to your brain that it's time to transition to sleep. They create a sense of safety and routine. Medieval people understood this instinctively. Their elaborate nighttime rituals served the same function our modern routines do, except theirs had to address more severe threats. There's also evidence that these rituals were teaching tools, ways to pass on important knowledge. A parent teaching a child to say prayers, to place iron under the pillow, to thank the fire, was teaching survival skills disguised as spirituality. And maybe that's the deepest truth here. Medieval people didn't really distinguish between practical and spiritual protection. It was all protection. The blanket that kept you warm and the prayer that eased your fear were doing the same fundamental work, keeping you alive until morning. So tonight, whatever your beliefs, maybe your own bedtime routine is serving the same purpose. Whether it's checking the doors, setting an alarm, reading a few pages, saying a prayer, or just pulling the blankets up in a particular way, you're creating a ritual that signals safety. You're continuing a human tradition that goes back thousands of years. We're nearly at the end of this journey, but we have two more crucial topics to cover. First, we need to talk about the most vulnerable people in medieval households and how they were protected. The children and the elderly, whose survival was never guaranteed. And finally, we'll discuss the legends and warnings that medieval people told about cold nights, the stories that carried real wisdom. Stay with me to the end, and if you've made it this far, you're amazing. Leave a comment telling me what you thought. Chapter 11. The Vulnerable Ones. Every medieval household knew that winter was most dangerous for two groups, the very young and the very old. Their bodies couldn't generate or maintain heat as effectively, and their survival required special measures. The stories of how families protected their most vulnerable members reveal something profound about medieval society. Let's start with infants and young children. In an age without modern medicine, infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Winter made it worse. A cold that would merely inconvenience an adult could kill a baby. Hypothermia could set in quickly. Parents were constantly vigilant. The primary defense was wrapping. Babies were swaddled tightly in layers of linen and wool, their movements restricted but their bodies conserved. The swaddling was kept almost rigid, creating a cocoon that held warmth. Modern eyes might find this restrictive, but it was effective. Cradles were positioned strategically, almost always near the hearth, but not too near, because sparks and smoke were dangerous. Finding the right distance was crucial. Too far and the baby froze. Too close and the baby risked burns or breathing smoke. Some cradles had hoods or covers, creating an enclosed space similar to bed curtains for adults. The baby slept in a tiny tent, their breath warming the small volume of air around them. There's a heartbreaking detail in many wills and household accounts. Fur blankets and sheepskins specifically designated for babies. These were treasured possessions, carefully maintained and passed down. A family's best furs often went to protect their youngest members. Wet nurses and mothers often slept with babies for warmth. The adult's body heat kept the infant alive. This practice, called co-sleeping, was universal. The modern prohibition against it would have been incomprehensible to medieval people. Without it, babies simply wouldn't survive. But co-sleeping had its own dangers. There are tragic records of babies being accidentally smothered, rolled over by exhausted adults. This was common enough that church officials issued warnings about it. But the alternative, letting the baby sleep alone in a cold chamber, was even more dangerous. Young children past infancy were often grouped together for sleep. 3 or 4 siblings in one bed, their combined body heat keeping them all warmer. Older children on the outside, youngest in the middle, maximizing protection for the most vulnerable. There are beautiful manuscript illustrations showing this. Tiny faces peeking out from under shared blankets, all huddled together. It looks cute to us. For them, it was survival. Elderly people faced different challenges. Their circulation was poorer, their bodies generated less heat, and they were more susceptible to illnesses that cold triggered. In a world without retirement homes or specialized elder care, families had to figure out how to keep their elderly members alive through winter. The most common solution was proximity to heat. Elderly family members got the spots closest to the fire. In peasant cottages, grandparents slept in alcoves or corners nearest the hearth. In wealthier households, they might have chambers deliberately positioned above kitchens or bakehouses. Extra blankets and furs were allocated to elderly sleepers. If resources were limited, they went to children and elders first, with healthy adults making do with less. This prioritization was culturally ingrained. You protected the vulnerable. There's a touching detail in several household accounts. Heated stones or bricks specifically for elderly family members. These would be heated in the fire, wrapped carefully, and placed in bed with grandparents hours before they retired. By the time they went to sleep, the bed would be pre-warmed. Some families went further. I found references to elderly people being given sheepskin shoes to wear in bed, keeping their feet warm, or having their beds positioned with curtains on only 3 sides, leaving one side open toward the fire for more direct heat. Medieval people also understood that the elderly needed company. Isolation was dangerous, both physically and mentally. Grandparents rarely slept alone. They shared chambers with adult children or grandchildren, ensuring that if they had problems during the night, someone would notice. There's a beautiful practice documented in several regions, the warming grandchild. This was a child, often a grandchild, whose specific job was to sleep beside an elderly family member, providing warmth and companionship. This child would be praised and given small rewards for taking on this responsibility. But despite all these efforts, winter still claimed many young and old. Parish records show mortality spiking in January and February. Babies born in autumn, facing their first winter at a few months old, had lower survival rates than those born in spring. Elderly people who seemed healthy in November might not survive to March. Families knew this. They lived with the knowledge that winter might take their loved ones. This created a different relationship with death than we have. It was expected, almost routine. Though no less grieved, there are prayers specifically for vulnerable sleepers. Lord, keep the cold from the young and old, whose candles burn less bright. Guard them through this night and grant them dawn. These prayers were said not just by families but by entire communities. Everyone understood that protecting the vulnerable was a collective responsibility. This communal approach extended beyond individual families. In villages, if a family had a particularly vulnerable member, neighbours might contribute. Extra firewood, spare blankets, offers to check in during the night. The social fabric was stronger because survival often depended on it. In monasteries and convents, protecting elderly members was a formal duty. Younger monks and nuns were assigned to care for older ones, ensuring their chambers were warm, their beds prepared, their needs met. This was considered a spiritual practice, serving God by serving his elderly servants. What strikes me about all of this is the intentionality. Medieval people didn't just hope children and elders would survive. They actively worked to protect them, allocating resources, adjusting sleeping arrangements, maintaining constant vigilance. It wasn't perfect. Many still died. But the effort was real and culturally ingrained. Compare this to modern society, where we often isolate our elderly in institutions, where children sometimes sleep alone from infancy. We've gained independence and privacy, but we've lost something of that communal care. I'm not romanticizing medieval life. Their world was brutal in many ways, but in this specific area, protecting vulnerable sleepers, they had something we might learn from. The understanding that survival is communal, that the strong have responsibility for the weak, that warmth and safety should be shared. So as we move to our final section, remember those vulnerable sleepers, the babies swaddled tight against the cold, the children huddled together, the grandparents positioned carefully near the fire. They survived, when they survived, because people cared enough to try, and that's worth remembering. Chapter 12. Tales from the Frozen Edge. We're coming to the end of our journey through medieval sleep, but I want to close with something that brings all of this together: the stories medieval people told about cold nights. Because embedded in their legends, cautionary tales, and folklore are the real experiences of people who lived this life. There's a story that appears in several forms across Northern Europe. It's about a knight who boasts that he needs no fire, no blankets, nothing but his own strength to survive the cold. To prove it, he spends a winter's night on the battlements with only his cloak. The story always ends the same way. By morning he's dead, frozen solid in his pride. The tale exists in German, English, French, and Scandinavian versions. The details change, but the core is constant. Cold doesn't care about your courage. Arrogance gets you killed. This wasn't just a morality tale. It was a survival lesson disguised as a story. Children who heard it learned that you respect the cold, that pride is dangerous, that survival requires preparation and humility. There's another common tale type. The story of a traveller who refuses hospitality, who thinks he can reach the next village despite warnings about the approaching storm. He's always found frozen in the snow, sometimes holding his purse, having died rather than spend money on lodging. Again, the lesson is practical. Accept help. Don't take chances with cold. Value life over pride or money. But not all the stories were cautionary. Some celebrated survival and cleverness. There's a folk tale about a poor woman who keeps her children alive through winter by layering them in straw, turning their bed into a nest. The story portrays this not as desperation but as wisdom. She uses what she has. She survives through ingenuity. These positive stories were important too. They taught that poverty didn't mean defeat, that clever adaptation could overcome disadvantage. Historical records contain real stories that became legendary. There's an account from 1348 of a siege during winter. The attacking army camped outside the castle walls, expecting to starve the defenders out. But the cold was worse than the siege. The attackers, sleeping in tents, lost dozens of men to hypothermia. Inside the castle, despite limited food, people survived because they had walls and hearths. The siege was lifted not because the defenders surrendered, but because the attackers couldn't endure the cold. That story was repeated for generations as proof that castles, for all their discomforts, did save lives. There are darker tales too, whispers of winters so severe that entire households froze. Villages where people were found in spring still in their beds, having died in the night. These stories were probably exaggerated, but they circulated because they expressed real fears. One tale speaks of a winter when frost came alive, walking through villages and touching people with fingers of ice. Those touched would waste away, coughing and weak, dying before spring. This is almost certainly a memory of an epidemic, perhaps influenza or pneumonia, that struck during a particularly cold winter. But the metaphor, cold as a living killer, reveals how medieval people understood their environment. Monks wrote about nights of trial, when faith was tested by physical suffering. Some described lying awake in freezing dormitories, praying through chattering teeth, feeling their devotion proven by their willingness to endure. These weren't horror stories, they were sources of pride. Suffering voluntarily for God was meritorious. There's a beautiful account from a nun named Gertrude writing in the 13th century. She describes a winter night when her cell was so cold she couldn't sleep. Instead of complaining, she meditated on the cold as a gift, a reminder of her mortality, a small taste of purgatory that would reduce her time there after death. She turned suffering into meaning. That's a very medieval thing. the ability to find purpose in hardship. We might see it as rationalization, making the best of a bad situation. But for them, it was genuine. Their worldview provided frameworks for understanding and accepting difficulty. Not everyone achieved that acceptance, of course. There are complaint poems, usually humorous, about the misery of cold nights. One anonymous English poem from the 14th century describes a monk who prays for summer, confesses he'd rather be in hell because at least it's warm, then repents and asks forgiveness for blasphemy. It's funny, but the underlying suffering is real. These stories, whether legendary or historical, served purposes beyond entertainment. They were memory devices, preserving survival knowledge. They were teaching tools, passing on wisdom to new generations. They were community builders, giving people shared narratives. And they were coping mechanisms. When you can tell stories about the cold, when you can turn suffering into narrative, it becomes more bearable. The cold is still there, still dangerous, but it's been given shape and meaning. I think that's one of the most important things we've learned in this journey. Medieval people didn't just endure cold passively. They engaged with it. They developed technologies, strategies, rituals, and stories. They turned survival into culture. Every blanket, every warming pan, every prayer, every tale was part of a complex system for living with hardship. They didn't eliminate the problem. They couldn't. But they built lives around it, lives that included joy, love, creativity, and meaning despite the constant presence of cold and danger. As we close, I want you to think about your own bed, your warm, comfortable, climate-controlled sleeping space. Appreciate it. Not with guilt, but with genuine gratitude. You've won a lottery medieval people couldn't even imagine. Every night, you experience comfort that even the richest king of 1400 couldn't achieve. But also, maybe, take a moment to admire those medieval sleepers. They faced something we've forgotten. They fought a nightly battle against forces that wanted to kill them, and they won. Not every night, not everyone, but enough. Enough to have children who had children who eventually became us. We exist because they survived those frozen nights, because they were clever enough to invent warming pans and strong enough to endure when invention wasn't enough, because they cared for children and elders, because they told stories that taught survival. That's the real message of medieval sleep. Not that they suffered, though they did, but that they survived, they adapted, and they found ways to make even the hardest nights bearable. So tonight, as you drift off in comfort, remember them. The nobles in their cold castles, the peasants in their smoky cottages, the monks in their stone cells, the mothers warming babies by the fire, the grandfathers positioned carefully near the hearth. They're all sleeping now in a different way, but their struggle, their ingenuity, their resilience, those live on. In the homes we build, the beds we sleep in, the value we place on warmth and comfort. We inherited their hard-won wisdom. Sleep well, and dream of stone castles and winter nights, of fires that fought the dark, of blankets piled high against the cold. Dream of a world where sleep was earned, not assumed, where every morning was a victory. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this journey through the coldest nights history has to offer.